Morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We're on the Ramban on chapter 25, verse 1, right in the middle of the Ramban, beginning with the words Behar ha'inyan on Pasuk Aleph, where we left off with the Ramban said that the opening pasuk of this parsha says that God said this to Moshe at Har Sinai. So what we discussed yesterday was what was the importance of saying it was at Har Sinai. We discussed the Ramban and Rashi, but where we left off, the Ramban made a kind of a pregnant statement. The Ramban said that actually this was not said when God first was giving the Torah to the Jewish people. These halachos were conveyed to Moshe when Moshe was up to receive the second tablets, after the first tablets had been broken. And that's just a very interesting, what's that all about? Ubir ha'inyan, and the explanation of the matter is, kasav Moshe b'sefer bris as kol divrei Hashem. In those first 40 days, Moshe wrote all the words of God, and all of the laws, and he sprinkled blood representing the covenant on the people. And when they sinned, and because of the sin of the golden calf, the tablets were broken by Moshe. It was like the covenant was nullified. The breaking of the luchos, these are my words, not the Ramban's, but the breaking of the luchos was like a contract being torn, like ripped. When God was appeased and God decided to give a new set of tablets to the Jewish people, he's now instructing Moshe regarding a new covenant with the Jewish people. Shneimar, Hine anochi koreis bris. In the aftermath of the forgiveness of the golden calf, God says to Moshe, behold, I'm making a covenant with you. What do you mean you're making a covenant with us? We already had a covenant. No, you did have a covenant, but that covenant was over because of the sin of the golden calf and the breaking of the tablets. So now we have to sign anew, so to say. We have to make a new covenant. The hichsir shama mitzvos hachamuros shenemru b'seder ve'elu hamishpatim b'bris harishona. So first of all, it goes through the sort of the very weighty mitzvos that were conveyed into Parsha Mishpatim. If you remember from the weekly discussions, everybody thinks the Parsha of Yisro is all about the Har Sinai and the giving of the Torah. Yes and no. What's the most famous quote from Har Sinai? Nasa v'nishma, right? What Parsha is Nasa v'nishma said in? Parshas Mishpatim. It's not said in Parshas Yisro. So the end of Parshas Mishpatim is sort of like the closure of the piece of how the Jewish people were at the giving of the Torah, which implies that everything said in Parshas Mishpatim were part of the core things conveyed up at Har Sinai in preparation for the giving of the first tablets. Okay, so now God says to Moshe, we're going to make a new covenant. And he reviews with him all of those types of mitzvos that were imparted in Mishpatim. He says to him, write these things because based on these things is this new covenant. But now, says the Ramban, for this new covenant, God changes the recipe a little bit. And God says there are going to be curses now in the new covenant. And there are going to be statements that if you don't serve me appropriately, there will be various punishments. V'shetiya karishona al kol ha-mitzvos harishona so kol ha-mishpatim, k'mo shenemar b'bris harishona as kol divrei Hashem as kol ha-mishpatim. And in addition to the new curses and the new potential punishments, we include with that all of the initial halachos, all the initial mitzvahs that were originally conveyed for the giving of the first tablets. Ulefichach amar bekan b'sof hatochachos ele hachukim v'atoros asher nasan Hashem beino ve'im b'nei Yisrael Behar Sinai biyad Moshe. After the strong psukim in next week's parsha of the Tochacha, of the harsh rebuke, it says, these are the laws that God conveyed between God and Israel at Har Sinai through Moshe. who romes el kol mitzvos v'mishpatim shneber b'brisa rishona b'seder ve'el mishpatim shiukulam b'brisa zos. So that catch-all language, if this is what was conveyed by God to Moshe at Har Sinai, implies a reference to all of the initial halachos that were conveyed before the breaking of the tablets. V'hinei b'sefer habris harishon nemra hashvius bichlal k'moshi's karti. In Parshas Mishpatim, there was a broad statement about the mitzvah of Shemitah, as we mentioned yesterday. Shenemar v'ashviyis tishmetenu tashta v'ata b'bris hasos hashenis nemra b'pratev diktukeh ve'on sheha. Now, in these psukim, not only does it give the details, but it implies punishments, whether it be punishments in terms of the rebuke that we'll have next week's parsha, whether it be, I don't know if we'll get to it or not this week, but there are various interesting midrashim. There are all these financial problems that are discussed in this week's parsha, problems of different financial shortcomings, and there's sort of a progression that implies that if a person doesn't treat the laws of Shemitah properly, there will be challenges. God will send punishments if a person doesn't treat Shemitah properly. So it's not just the details being conveyed, there's more of a stick being conveyed in this new set of instructions than we had before. That, of course, makes sense because the Jewish people, through the sin of the golden calf, have proven that they need that stick. Moshe was commanded regarding the Mishkan in those first 40 days. Yarad Moshe v'yitzaveimus kol asher tzivu Hashem oso b'Har Sinai v'yamase hamishkan b'chlalam. So Moshe comes down. He says, "I want to convey to you all, after the second tablets have been given." Moshe comes down and says, "I want to convey to you everything God commanded me, including the Mishkan." V'az hikel Moshe eskol das ben Yisrael v'yomer lehem kibatchila elad dvarim asher tzivu Hashem lasos asam melechas hamishkan. So he says, "Let me tell you what God instructed me to share with you regarding the Mishkan." V'nei kiblu hadavar b'simcha. They were very happy after they had received the forgiveness of the second tablets. Then Moshe tells them about this Mishkan concept. They were very excited about it. V'yatzu milfanav miyad. They immediately left him. Uba'u kulam v'nastu hanadava v'asu hamishkan v'ishklimu mulachto. So they got right to it, and they worked on the Mishkan, and then the Mishkan was completed. V'kasher hukam miyad v'ikra Moshe v'daber Hashem elav me'ol moed. And then once the Mishkan was established, so now there's all these instructions that have to be imparted regarding how the sacrifices should go and how the laws of the Kohanim should be. And that's the bulk of the book of Vayikra. Don't tell anybody, but we're almost finished with that book now, right? The bulk of it has been about laws involving the Kohanim. V'tzivo b'korbanos u'b'chol toras ha'Kohanim. Moshe tziva l'kol al Aaron v'al banav kol b'nei Yisrael miyad. And Moshe in turn conveys all of those to the Jewish people. V'kasher hishlim Amar lehem od tziva osi Hashem b'Har Sinai lefarish lochem hashmita v'hayovel. Once we're done with all of that about the Mishkan, now Moshe says, I have to go on to another topic that God discussed with me in those 40 days before I brought down the second tablets, and that is the concept of Shemitah, the concept of the Jubilee year also, which is what's discussed at the beginning of this week's parsha. V'lichros lochem akol hamitzvah v'mishpatim bris chadasha ba'alo b'shvua. And I'm supposed to convey to you, as we also have at the beginning of next week's parsha, the scene of Har Grizim and Har Evel. And that the idea is that there are these very, very strong messages that you have to observe the different mitzvahs of God. Wait a second. You're telling me there's a new covenant going on here after the writing of the second tablets? Where's the sprinkling of the blood? The sprinkling of the blood happened at Har Sinai for the first acceptance of the Torah. But the Ramban said that whole deal was canceled and only got renewed once God gives Moshe the second tablet. So you need to have a new signing, so to say. You need to have a new sprinkling of the blood. With the administration of the different curses, if you don't do this, you'll get this problem and that problem. Their acceptance of that is equivalent to having the blood sprinkled upon them. Okay. I think we can hold here in terms of that Ramban, but it's a very interesting picture, a very interesting perspective. it doesn't change the question of why it has to say Behar Sinai, and that's that discussion from yesterday, but it's a whole new way of thinking about the import of understanding that these were said at Har Sinai. It's a whole new perspective on what happened in between the breaking of the first tablets and the presentation of the second tablets to the Jewish people. Okay. The first mitzvah, as we've been referencing various times over these days, is the mitzvah of Shemitah. I'd like to see the Kli Yakar describing the mitzvah of Shemitah. We'll get started today. We'll see how far we get. Pasuk Beis in the Kli Yakar. V'shav Saha Aretz Shabbos LaHashem. B'tam mitzvazu yesh deos chalukos. Regarding this concept, the reasoning behind this mitzvah of letting the land lay fallow on the seventh year, there are different ideas. Ki Rabbim Amar, many say, Shatamu shetishbos aretz k'dei shetosif teis kochel ezroa. There's an idea that God says every 7 years the land has to be laid rest so that it can generate enough nutrients and the like to have a meaningful growth a year later. You need to give it a year's rest. Uladeyazu nata Rav Amora. That has how the Rambam is inclined. And that therefore the mitzvah of Shemitah, like many mitzvahs according to the Rambam, is practical guidance from God how to get the best out of this world. But many argue on the Rambam. What happens? What are we taught will happen if the Jewish people aren't diligent about the mitzvah of Shemitah? We've made reference to it various times already. We're taught the Jewish people will be exiled from the land. So hold on a second. If the reason why God wants us to keep the mitzvah of Shemitah is because the land will generate the produce best if we keep the mitzvah of Shemitah, so let that be the punishment. Let it be that if we don't keep the mitzvah of Shemitah, the grain won't grow so high behind them, right? That the fact that we don't listen will be its own punishment, right? If that's the only reason for it. Why does the Torah, when describing the mitzvah of Shemitah, say the land will rest, a resting for God? What do you mean a resting for God? It's not a resting for God, it's a resting for the land. God just gave us the user's manual. There's a language. When you don't keep the Shemitah, you'll be exiled from the land, and then the land will have its rest. What do you mean, then the land will have its rest? You think the non-Jews who come in are going to keep Shemitah? Well, what are you talking about? So these points are very difficult to understand if you understand Shemitah as just being practical guidance from God how to run this agricultural society. Vakeda nasan tamach. And the Akedah gives another reason. V'yamar shtachlis mitzvazu. The purpose of this mitzvah is to remember and remind of God's creation of the world. And to remember history, where we've been, where we're going. The Rabbanel writes something similar, so that it's to give a perspective. It's to give a perspective on God's creation of the world. Kli Yakar says, I think this is a difficult pshat also. If I were to ask you, quick, mitzvah association, what mitzvah is there to remember that God created the world? My guess is at least 70% of the people on the Zoom would answer Shabbos, right? And the other 30 would say Sunday. No, I'm just kidding. But at least, so people would know it's Shabbos. So every 7 days we have a mitzvah to remind us that God created the world. So we need every 7 years to remind us that God really created the world. Difficult to understand. And if you tell me that you think the Jewish people don't get it from Shabbos, what is it about Shemitah that will bring the point home more than Shabbos? So we will, God willing, get to the Kli Yakar's perspective tomorrow. He cited the Rambam, who says it's a practical thing. He cited the Akedah, who says it's to remember that God created the world. But he's going to say his own pshat. We'll see that tomorrow, God willing. And we also discuss the Ramban's discussion of when and why the halachos, the details of Shemitah, were conveyed to Moshe Rabbeinu.